All right, well, let's get going. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're sitting. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us today for our webinar. Today, we'll be talking about the Grassland Synthesis Project. This is the last webinar for this semester before we break for the summer, but we will be back in September, so we'll hope to see you then. As always, this webinar is hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, also called the NC CASC, and we are based at the University of Colorado in Boulder. My name is Heather Yoakum. I am the lead social scientist here at the North Central CASC, and I co-host this webinar with my colleague, Imtiaz Ringwala, who's the climate science lead. And we bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices that are related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate. And we have a focus on the North Central US, and that encompasses the Missouri and Upper Colorado River basins. And so before I introduce the speakers today, just a quick word on logistics. So we are recording this webinar, and you can find all of our webinar recordings on our website. And during the webinar, all of the participants will be muted, but you'll have the ability to unmute during the question and answer period at the end of the presentation. In the meantime, though, we do encourage you to put your questions or comments in the chat. Anytime during the webinar, we'll be monitoring that. And we'll start with those questions first during the Q&A session in the order that they are received. And we will end the formal part of this webinar at noon Mountain Time, and we'll stop the recording. But after that, anyone who wishes to stay on for a couple more minutes, like 10 or 15, 20 minutes, to engage in a more informal conversation with the speakers is encouraged to do so. Those are always really fun if you're interested in the topic. So this is where it's going to get a little bit different. Now I'm really delighted to introduce our speakers for today, Dr. Christine Miller-Hesed, and then also myself. So that's going to be fun to introduce myself in a minute, and a little awkward. But first, Dr. Christine Miller-Hesed is a conservation biologist and environmental anthropologist whose work focuses on engaging diverse stakeholders in climate adaptation planning. She's located in rural Kansas and is exploring ways in which natural resource management decisions may impact rural and tribal communities' vulnerability to climate change. And she also has coordinated 2 different working groups to assess and report on climate science and adaptation knowledge gaps for the grasslands in the North Central region of the United States, which you'll hear about today. And prior to working at the NC CASC, in the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, or CIRES, which again is here at CU Boulder, Christy was the project director of Engaging Faith Communities for Coastal Resilience, an applied research project that brought together rural church communities with scientists, conservation organizations, and county and state government employees to address climate change on the Chesapeake Bay. Her doctoral research focused on rural African-American communities in the Chesapeake Bay area in order to understand environmental justice, vulnerability, adaptation, and resilience to sea level rise. So Christy is a former EPA STAR Fellow, and Christy served as the research coordinator for the Grasslands Project. And so now I will awkwardly introduce myself. So as you know, I sit here at CU Boulder, and I'm the social science lead here at the NC CASC. I'm also a research scientist at CIRES. I'm also an environmental anthropologist and a political ecologist. And so that means that I focus on understanding decision-making around natural resources, how to create actionable and usable science, and how humans interact with and understand the world around us. So I joined CIRES almost 10 years ago in 2014 as a postdoc, and I started working at the NOAA Earth System Research Lab and the Physical Science Lab. And since then, I've also worked with the Western Water Assessment, which is a NOAA CAP-RISA program, and also the NC CASC. And I've worked with federal, state, tribal, nonprofit, and private land and water managers on generating and applying climate information to inform their adaptation plans. I'm currently working on projects to understand decision-making in national parks, and working with the state of Colorado to update vulnerability assessments to include frontline and disproportionately impacted communities. And as part of the CASC, I also coordinate the Tribal Climate Leaders Program and the Climate Adaptation Scientists of Tomorrow program. And both of those support students from historically excluded communities to become leaders in fields related to climate adaptation. And so I served as the PI for the Grasslands project that you are about to hear about. So without further ado, here we go. Christy, can you put it to the next slide, please? Thank you. So like I said, you'll hear from me just very briefly at the beginning. I'll talk about kind of the project impetus and the design, and then I'll hand it over to Christy to talk about our methods and the process for how we actually did what we did, to talk about our findings and our outputs, and then talk about some of our next steps. Next slide, please. So the NC CASC, we realized a couple years ago that we really hadn't done a whole lot of work with our grassland managers or the grassland ecosystems in our region. And so as you can see from the map on this slide, it shows the location of different grassland ecosystems across our 7-state region. And as you can see with all those different colors, those are different management agencies. And so those are all of the different various managers of these grassland protected areas. And so as you can see, they're a huge part of the NC CASC geography, and there's a lot of different state, tribal, federal, and nonprofit or private managers of these areas. And we really wanted to make sure that we were working more closely with all of them. So we designed a project that would provide a baseline of information needs and available science, because we know that there's actually a lot of great work that is already going on in these areas. And so we wanted to be able to create a baseline of information so that we knew what types of research was already out there, what types of information was already available, and we could identify research gaps where the CASC might be able to effectively plug in or contribute to the ongoing research efforts. And so we focused for this project, we focused on available information so that we could reduce stakeholder fatigue. And this is a really important part of our process. We did this very intentionally. We wanted to make sure that we began with understanding the management context and information needs of all of these various grassland managers across our region. And there is already a lot of information out there about that. And so we intentionally decided to focus on using available reports and management documents and other literature, so that we could, again, create this baseline of understanding, which could provide a foundation for future conversations and research collaborations with all of these different grassland managers. And so this way, when we do reach out and speak to these managers to start working with them, we are doing so from a really informed place. We don't have to start from scratch. And so we designed this project back in 2019, and it was funded in 2020. And then Christy joined us in the fall of 2020 to serve as the research coordinator. So Christy, with that, I will hand it over to you to talk more about the project.
Thanks, Heather. You did a great job introducing yourself, but I would have said more nice things. You should have had me introduce you. So hi, everyone. I'm Christy Miller-Hesed, as Heather said. So I was the research coordinator for the Grassland Synthesis Project. And I wanted to start by just giving an overview of all the pieces that went into this synthesis. So this was conducted by 2 working groups and an advisory committee. And together, those 3 groups were composed of 59 people. And these people met over 96 Zoom meetings over a span of 20 months. And together we reviewed and synthesized 183 grassland management planning documents, reports, swaps, those types of things, as well as 994, though that might be a conservative estimate, references on climate and ecology of grasslands. And these were peer-reviewed papers. So just totaling those documents, that's 1,177 references that went into this synthesis. And this has yielded a lot of different outputs. So we've published 2 open file reports through US Geological Survey. We've had 2 data releases, and this synthesis has also helped to inform a grasslands and climate change training series. And then we have forthcoming 2 full reports, which together total 682 pages. But we thought that might be a lot for some who might be interested in more bite-sized pieces of information. So we're also developing a series of 2-page fact sheets. And we plan to have 15 of these that will cover topics ranging from changes in temperature and precipitation to management of grazers. So I want to emphasize that this synthesis was conducted by 59 people who together provided expertise for the broad range of topics that were covered in these reports. So I myself do not claim to be an expert in all of these topics, and I do really welcome your questions, but I may need to refer you to others for answers. So we'll see how we do with that. Today, I'm going to walk through the information that is currently available in some of our outputs, and also preview some that are forthcoming. So we'll start with the open file reports. These open file reports are what I think of as our sort of syntheses in brief. So as I mentioned, we do have 2 full reports that are written, and they're awaiting publication through US Geological Survey. But we wanted to release some of our central findings as soon as possible, both so that they can be available to the public, and also to allow the findings to be cited in the 5th National Climate Assessment. And so we took kind of the highlights from each of the full reports and published them as these open file reports. So the first one is titled Grassland Management Priorities for the North Central Region. And that is the report that's based on the work of the Management Priorities Working Group. And that group took all that management literature, 183 grassland reports, plans from all the different federal and state agencies, some example NGOs, a couple of examples from tribal nations, and tried to identify what are the broadly shared grassland management goals, challenges, and information needs given a changing climate for our region. The second open file report is based on the full report by what we called our Climate and Ecology Working Group. And this one's titled Synthesis of Climate and Ecological Science to Support Grassland Management Priorities in the North Central Region. And I'll say more about each of these. Here, for brevity, I'm going to refer to the first report on management as Volume 1 and the second report as Volume 2. And before I dive into the contents in these reports, I wanted to just say how could you use the information in these open file reports? So if you're a researcher, both volumes 1 and 2 can help you to identify research questions that are needed to be answered. And volume 1 also provides a primer on different agencies and organizations that are managing grasslands. And this can help you identify potential partners in your research or key stakeholders that you might want to collaborate with. And volume 2 can also give you some ideas on how to build interdisciplinary research teams to better address grassland management questions. If you manage grasslands, volume 1 could be helpful in communicating your information needs to interested researchers. And it can also provide a snapshot of other agencies managing grasslands, so you can identify those that might have similar management goals and challenges. Volume 2 provides summaries of climate impacts for grassland ecosystems in the North Central region. So that's how we imagine it can be used, but let's look at some of the main findings of each of these open file reports. Again, the first one is titled Grassland Management Priorities for the North Central Region, and it was written by the Management Priorities Working Group. You can see the list of authors there, and Heather will put a link in the chat for this publication. And this open file report shares some of the main findings from our synthesis of grassland management documents. First, grassland management agencies in the region are diverse in their organizational structures, their goals, the particular management actions that they take. but they do share many of the same climate-related challenges and information needs. One of our findings was that increased collaboration and coordination among these various grassland management entities could be really important for successful conservation of grasslands in the North Central region in a changing climate. In our synthesis, we found that across grassland management entities, grassland management goals are varied. They sometimes can even conflict across neighboring lands. One example of this is some consider black-tailed prairie dogs to be desirable and are working to promote habitat for them. And on a neighboring land, they're being managed as pests. I do want to highlight the Grasslands roadmap, which probably many of you are familiar with. But for those of you who aren't, this is a recent tri-national effort to engage federal agencies, indigenous communities, state and provincial agencies, among many others, to articulate shared goals and to work together to try to achieve grassland conservation. And the shared goal that the Grasslands Roadmap articulates is, quote, diverse grasslands with thriving indigenous and rural communities, millions of acres of connected land under various types of conservation, profitable working land with livestock and regenerative agriculture, flourishing ecosystems of soil, plants, and wildlife, and rivers and wetlands supporting aquifers, wildlife, production, and people, end quote. So I highlight that because we found that articulated goal really aligned quite well with the goals that emerged from our review of grassland management documents. So you can see in this table, we identified 5 primary goals. So managing grasslands for recreation, such as hiking, fishing, and hunting, as well as for productive, sustainable grazing, were important goals across many of the management groups. Historic and cultural preservation and energy development were also important goals for a smaller subset of grassland managers. But importantly, we saw that managing grasslands for conservation is a widely shared goal across all the grassland management groups in our region. And so that's the focus of this report. And for this synthesis, we defined conservation as the protection and restoration of biodiverse, heterogeneous grassland ecosystems and their ecological processes. So a second main finding was the identification of broadly shared information needs. And so we identified 15 main areas in which information is needed to help grassland managers meet their needs in a changing climate. And these main areas of information needs can be grouped into information on direct threats to grasslands and contributing factors, which are those things which indirectly affect grasslands. So the direct threats to grasslands include grassland loss and fragmentation, disruption of the historical disturbance regime, woody encroachment, herbaceous invasives, unsustainable grazing, change in water quality and quantity, wildlife population declines, as well as the state of conservation on private lands. And then contributing factors to grassland health or degradation include public understanding of grasslands, legal and policy drivers, economic incentives, coordination of actions across agencies, organizations, jurisdictions, and borders, the availability of usable science and tools, and frameworks available for conceptualizing these novel problems and solutions. The Management Priorities Working Group phrased these 15 main information needs related to each of these direct threats and contributing factors as questions. And each of these 15 questions also had more specific supporting questions. And so the total list is 70 questions that, if answered, could help grassland managers better meet their goals in a changing climate. I'm not going to list all 70 of these questions here. I already feel apologetic for how text-heavy my slides are, but you can find those 70 questions in the Open File report. So the second Open File report, the synthesis of climate and ecological science to support grassland management priorities in the North Central region, was written by the Climate and Ecology Working Group. You can see the authors listed there, and Heather can put a link to this report in the chat as well. So that first working group, the Management Priorities Working Group, synthesized management documents and identified information that was the information needs that are broadly shared by grassland managers in order to meet their goals in a changing climate. But the next step was to identify which of those 70 questions we already have answers to, and where we need to direct future research to address the questions that we don't yet have good answers for. And so the Climate and Ecology Working Group synthesized peer-reviewed climate and ecology literature to address those 70 questions. Due to how interconnected grassland systems are, many of the climate and ecological factors are important for answering multiple of the 70 questions that were identified by the first working group. So, for example, understanding how variability of precipitation will change is relevant to understanding where grasslands are likely to be lost to other land uses, best practices for grassland restoration, changes in disturbance regimes and woody encroachment and herbaceous invasives. It all is interconnected. So rather than addressing each question individually, the Climate and Ecology Working Group reorganized those questions into 5 topical areas, and then we created sub-working groups to address those 5 subtopical areas. So the first one was sort of the physical science group, and they focused on temperature, precipitation, water, and fire. The second group looked at impacts to vegetation. The third group looked at wildlife. The fourth looked at grazers. And then the fifth group looked at land use change. And so I'll briefly highlight some of the key findings from each of those groups in this open file report. So I want to acknowledge that the work of this first group was led by Imtiaz Rangwala, with contributions from Jill Marie Stevens, Kathy Chase, Owen McKenna, and David Hoover. And so some of the key findings from the synthesis. First, temperatures across the North Central region have increased by 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the early 1900s, and they're projected to increase 4 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit by the mid-21st century and 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the late 21st century, depending on future greenhouse gas emissions. Second, precipitation has increased across much of the region in all seasons, and climate models project significant increases in winter and spring precipitation and plausible decreases in summer precipitation. Third, warmer temperatures are expected to offset increases in future precipitation and affect water demand and water availability. Changing seasonal patterns of water availability, such as soil moisture or stream flow, are expected, and this could include wetter springs and drier late summers and falls. Fourth, increased temperature will result in more precipitation falling as rain rather than snow in the future, and this will lead to more runoff and stream flow in winter and spring, and decreased runoff and stream flow in late summer and fall, with some spatial variation. For example, the Missouri River Basin in Colorado has experienced increases in annual runoff in the eastern parts and decreases in the western and southern parts of the basin since the 1960s. Fifth, There is considerable uncertainty on how changes in temperature, precipitation, snow, and runoff will affect groundwater recharge. And I hope it's okay for me to highlight that I heard that we might be having a webinar on groundwater coming soon this fall, but maybe that's not confirmed yet, but I'm excited about it. So current rates of groundwater extraction in the northern Great Plains are expected to be sustainable. However, expected increases in demand for water and subsequent increases in human extraction of groundwater will decrease groundwater storage. And then finally, observed and projected increases in wildfire frequency and size are expected from increases in temperature. The length of the fire season and duration of extreme fire weather have also been increasing. And fuel treatments, such as prescribed fires and grazing, are becoming increasingly important for moderating wildfire behavior and intensity in a changing climate. However, safe windows for prescribed fire are shortening and changing. The vegetation subgroup was led by Amy Simstad with contributions from David Wood, Shelley Crosby, Jesse Nippert, Lauren Prensky, Chelsea Nagy, Brian Miller, and Danica Mosher. And just some highlights from their synthesis work. First, climate change impacts grassland vegetation across the north central region in a context of altered disturbance regimes and the introduction of novel species. So there's a lot of change happening, not just the climate changing. And species-specific responses complicate predicting shifts in the composition and diversity, but novel combinations of species are highly likely. Second, the balance between cool season and warm season grasses is likely to shift with climate change, and this has implications for biodiversity, productivity, livestock forage, and wildlife habitat. However, it's difficult to predict the impacts on vegetation due to the interactive effects of climate changes and carbon dioxide fertilization. Third, interacting effects of land use change and disturbance regimes have already facilitated an increase in woody plants in historically grass-dominated areas over the last 100 years. And the most sustainable and efficient management strategy to manage this woody encroachment is to minimize the initial spread of woody species into grasslands. Fourth, predicting effects of climate change on invasive species would benefit from a clear understanding of the current extent, abundance, and composition of these grasslands, the variety of interspecific interactions that confer biotic resistance to invasive species argues for the importance of maintaining high diversity of native species in all parts of the food web to reduce the likelihood of invasion as the climate changes. Fifth, climate change will affect net primary productivity and timing of plant biomass production, both of which are strongly controlled by climate factors that determine the length of the growing season and the variation in water availability over that period. Potential increased productivity is indicated in many future climate scenarios, but this potential is highly dependent on changes in precipitation seasonality, vegetation composition, and the phenotypic plasticity and adaptive capabilities of plant species, all of which have high uncertainty. And then finally, a highlight from the vegetative chapter, grassland ecosystems may undergo transformation to another ecological community. However, these transformations are very difficult to predict. Careful scenario-based consideration of the trade-offs and the viability of resisting, accepting, or directing change will be required. All right, the next sub-working group was the wildlife subgroup. This was led by Kevin Ellison with contributions from Anna Davidson, Marissa Ehlering, Jim Giacomo, David Lightfoot, Al Zale, and myself. So some highlights from the wildlife section. First, climate change is unsurprisingly going to put additional stress on wildlife populations by synergistically interacting with other environmental disturbances to shift and fragment wildlife habitat and also alter the timing of species life cycles. Those species with greater phenotypic plasticity will be better able to adapt to climate change impacts, while more specialized species with limited flexibility in their life cycle timing or specialized habitat requirements will be at greater risk of local extirpation. Second, and I'll just highlight here, we covered mammals, birds, fish, and arthropods. And so just giving some highlights here. So thinking about the prairie dog ecosystem, there's relatively little known about how climate change will shift or fragment the prairie dog ecosystem. However, suitable habitat for black-tailed prairie dogs has been projected into the future under both warm and wet and hot and dry climate scenarios. There are other interacting effects from climate change. For example, competition between prairie dogs and livestock can intensify as grassland vegetation decreases, which could be a result of drought. And so there's a lot of really complicated interactions with the prairie dog ecosystem and climate change. For all of you bird lovers, we know that grassland birds are of significant conservation concern because their populations have declined the most among all habitat-based groups in North America. Many of the projections for climate-based shifts in land bird distributions predict the breeding distributions for grassland birds are moving northward, with exceptions for sagebrush specialists. And then fish. So climate change is expected to significantly affect the hydrology of grassland streams and the fish that occupy them. So this will exacerbate the physicochemical stresses that prairie fishes have evolved to withstand by increasing water temperatures, reducing dissolved oxygen concentrations, increasing the toxicity of pollutants through concentration, and altering hydrology. Arthropod species, similarly, climate change is going to synergistically interact with other environmental disturbances to have an overall negative impact on many arthropod species. There's a lot of research needed on arthropods. The precise number of arthropod species in the Great Plains is not known, but could be in the tens of thousands. And like other animal wildlife groups, a more specialized species may not be able to adapt quickly to increasing temperatures and lengthening warm seasons because of their genetic inflexibility. And then an overall finding is that for all wildlife species, conservation in the face of climate change must incorporate consideration of socioeconomic context and policy, as well as relevant spatial scales. All right, our next chapter or subgroup was the large-bodied ruminants and grazing subgroup. Heroic effort by just 2 people on this one. It was led by Jeff Martin with contributions from Tony Clem. So I'll go through this rather quickly. First, impacts of climate change through warming temperatures and changes in hot and cold extremes throughout the year will have direct effects on the energy budgets of large-bodied grazing species. So we're talking about bison, cattle, horses, sheep, and elk throughout the north central region. Rising mean annual air temperature increases energy use for thermoregulatory and metabolic functions, which results in reduced body size. We also see in the literature potential decline in the availability and changes to the nutritional quality of palatable forage will indirectly affect grazing species growth, health, and performance. And although exposure to various direct and indirect effects of climate change may be similar across the north central grasslands, sensitivity and adaptive capacity will vary both geographically and across land jurisdictions and management sectors. And then this section also highlights that there are several ways to reduce the impacts of climate change on grazing, including converting marginal cropland back to perennial grasslands, increasing plant diversity, and planting nutritious forbs in existing grasslands. Right, and then our last topical subgroup, the land use change subgroup, was led by Heather Yoakum, with contributions from myself, Julie Elliott, and Jeremy Pittman. So some highlights. Changes in land use are, of course, driven by complex interactions between the availability of biophysical resources and socioeconomic factors, and both of these will be impacted by climate change. Climate change is also going to impact and shift which areas are best suited for different uses. So areas that currently are used for grazing or growing row crops may become less suitable for those uses. So there may be new areas that could be prioritized for restoration. Wind energy development is an important contributor to the decarbonization of the energy sector in the north central region, but it can fragment and degrade grassland habitats. However, these impacts can be mitigated by carefully selecting sites for wind turbines to reduce these negative impacts on grassland habitats and species. Urban, suburban, and exurban development has increased in this region since the 1950s, and it continues to lead to grassland loss, fragmentation, and degradation. I guess I'll leave it there because I want to keep going through these. And then a final point from the land use change section. As climate-driven changes in precipitation and temperature impact agriculture, again, it may be possible to target some of these lands for possible restoration or conversion to sustainable grazing land, which could benefit both grassland species and rural communities. So I also want to highlight that the Climate and Ecology Working Group worked to identify remaining research needs to support grassland managers in a changing climate. And all of the 59 people that were involved with the Grassland Synthesis Project were really important for helping us to identify what these remaining research needs are. However, the final work of sort of clarifying these and writing them up was done by the authors listed on the slide. So briefly, some key areas where additional research is needed. Synthesizing the social sciences was outside the scope of our initial synthesis effort, but will clearly be necessary to address all of the broadly shared information needs that were identified. Second, North Central grasslands are home to 27 federally recognized Native American tribes with traditional ecological knowledge, and collaboration with tribal members could help to inform successful grassland management in the face of climate change. Third, there are gaps in the existing information and in the climate and ecology literature where further research is needed. And so I list just a few examples. There's a longer list in the Open File-Report, but we need more refined spatial and temporal analyses. We need to improve predictions of changes in hydrology, stream flow, soil moisture. And then there's really a huge need for a greater study of the interactions among these multiple different components that can affect each other. And then we also highlight that collaboration between researchers and grassland managers in developing future research projects is really important to ensure that the information produced will be relevant, accessible, and usable for informing climate smart management decisions. Okay, so that was kind of a quick overview of the information that's available in the Open File reports. I'm going to be lightning quick in just talking about these remaining 4. So we scratched the first one off our list. We have a couple of data releases. I just want to draw your attention to these, and Heather can share links in the chat. The first data release is a table that has all of the 70 information needs that are discussed in the Management Priorities Report. And for each one, we have indicated its relevance to these different grassland management entities. So you see there's just a snippet of the table on the slide. An H indicates highly relevant, an S somewhat relevant, and an X that's not at all relevant. Our second data release is a compilation of all the species of greatest conservation need as identified in state wildlife action plans. And this, I think, would be helpful for anyone interested in addressing wildlife concerns in the region. I'll just mention that this project helped to inform a broad grasslands and climate change training series, which was co-organized by the North Central CASC, South Central CASC, Northwest CASC, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This was a multiple event sort of training series. Some of the events were webinars, and those are available at the website that Heather will put in the chat. We also had an in-person component, and I believe the PowerPoints from that in-person training are available at this website as well. Okay, and then I've talked about these 2 full reports. So I just wanted to briefly highlight the additional features that are going to be in these full reports once they're published. So the Management Priorities full report will have a chapter that differentiates threats and management opportunities by grassland ecoregion. It will also have chapters that give a kind of biography of these different grassland management agencies. I guess by biography, I mean it describes the specific grassland management goals, actions, and challenges for, let's say, Fish and Wildlife Service, for example. So there's a chapter on different federal grassland management agencies, on state Fish and Wildlife management agencies, on a couple of example non-governmental organizations as well. This full report also will have a chapter discussing tribal nations and some of the grassland management goals in the region, and an appendix with more fine-grained and specific examples of information needs organized by grassland management agency. And then the full report for the synthesis of climate and ecological data. It's going to include a full chapter discussing in more detail each of the 5 main topics from the Open File report. It also will have a full chapter discussion of future research needed and next steps. And then we'll have an appendix where the synthesized climate and ecological information, which was reorganized into those 5 sort of subtopics, is reorganized once again into those 70 management priorities working group questions. And so if you look at that list of 70 questions and you think, oh, I'm really interested in this particular one, you can go to the appendix of the second report, and it will summarize what we know in relation to that question and where we need future research to support that question. And then finally, we're developing a series of 2-page information sheets. We call our series the Prairie Climate Companion, and our first issue was released this week, and it's available on our website. So stay tuned for more of those coming out this summer. Okay, so I've talked through all of our planned outputs. Want to just be really clear before I open it up for questions that this work doesn't just sit on the shelf, but rather we're using these findings to help inform future research and collaborations in grassland ecosystems at the North Central CASC. So for example, this summer we have 2 graduate research assistants that are going to be working on projects related to this. One research assistant will be conducting the synthesis of social science relevant to grassland management that was identified as a need. And the other research assistant will be conducting interviews with grassland managers to further refine our understanding of priority information needs and how that information can be actionable. Okay, so I'd like to just give a huge thanks to Heather Yoakum for spearheading this effort, and also to everyone in the working groups and advisory committee, everyone else who supported this project. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and be happy to take any questions.
Yay, that was fantastic, Christy. Okay, so I was kind of responding to a couple of questions in the chat, but I also wanted, Christy to be able to weigh in. So Tony Clam, hi Tony, said that the research questions that we ID'd but didn't answer might be interesting for funding agencies. And have we basically had any contact with them, and how do we have any evidence that it's already influencing some funding efforts? So I had already mentioned that, yes, hey Tony, nice to see you, that these findings have already influenced the priorities that the NC CASC has been, the USGS team at the NC CASC has been using to kind of identify their priorities for funding. But yeah, Christy, I didn't know if you wanted to weigh in on that before we.
Yeah, I think I'm not aware of other specific examples where it's influencing funding. Our findings have just sort of been made public, so I would hope that we might see that they have more impact. But those open file reports were just published April 14, so it's still rather new.
Yeah, and as I mentioned in the chat, at the very least, we hope that, any of the folks on here, other researchers, can use this, in their proposals as just, additional justification, or, just kind of providing additional support for their proposal ideas and why we need to fund that type of research. So.
Cool, thanks.
So nice to see you.
Congratulations, yeah.
Yeah. And then Dennis Longknife also has a really interesting question. So Tony, this might actually be really interesting for you, so stick around. So the availability of native grasses for buffalo seems to be overlooked. In the natural world, buffalo followed the lush native grasses and migrated along them. In today's world, they have much to overcome, like fences, boundaries, relocation. And so Dennis would love to see a body mass index measured on Yellowstone buffalo and compare that to where they are relocated, since some herds may be considerably smaller and less healthy from where they, after they've been kind of relocated based on the different vegetation. So thoughts on that, Tony?
I can't. Good point. I can't really
totally put you on the spot there. Yeah.
Well, I think I'm a little outside the study area. Now I'm calling in from Germany. But I think this would be really cool for Jeff Martin, who's an assistant professor at South Dakota State University, if I'm not mistaken. We both did the chapter on large-bodied grazers. So he is still very much in the area and would be, I imagine, would be interested in this. So I would encourage you to reach out to him.
And I have his contact information, Dennis. If you want to send me an email, I can put you in touch with Jeff. I think he'd be really interested in that.
Yeah, and so Christy, I saw that you already answered Ariel's question about similar synthesis efforts, but is there anything else you'd like to say about that? And there's another question about, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just in reference that there was a question in the chat asking if any similar synthesis efforts have been done in other CASC geographies. And actually the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center did a grassland synthesis. I don't know if anyone from that center is on this webinar. If so, please feel free to jump in. But I think they conducted their synthesis similarly to what the original plan was for the North Central CASC. But once we started implementing our plan, the COVID pandemic was upon us. And so as I understand it, the Southeast CASC had someone pull together a lot of the literature ahead of time and then brought a group together for kind of an intensive weekend. I'm not sure exactly on these details, but they kind of brain dumped together and then had a report. Our process was different simply because we weren't able to be together. And so, you know, for better or worse, we ended up iterating over Zoom calls over a period of 20 months. And I think in some ways, perhaps we lost some of that in-person creative problem-solving thinking that really just emerges from those in-person interactions. But in other ways, I think having that iteration where we would meet, we'd separate for 2 weeks and kind of work on our individual pieces and then come back together. I think we were able to dive pretty deep into this question of how do we support grassland management and changing climate. So.
Yeah, and Christy, there was kind of a follow-up or related question about if we're aware of any similar work in the tallgrass prairie in the Midwest region. I'm sure there is some, but I don't know who exactly is doing it. I don't have details.
No, I'm not, but I don't know that it's not happening. The Midwest CASC is pretty new. I think they're still sort of getting their feet underneath them. And that's been something I've been wanting to do for a while is kind of reach out there and see where they're at in terms of their work with grassland ecosystems in the Midwest. But I don't honestly know where they're at with that.
Yeah, and everyone feel free to, if you have other questions, to unmute and pose them directly if you'd like. Oh, I see a question in the chat from Jessica Travis. Are we seeing any connections between this work and initiatives rolling out with the Inflation Reduction Act? Ooh, great question. Christy,
I would love to see that. I guess I'm not. I've been too head down with this project to look up and see if there are connections there. I don't know if anyone is anyone seeing those connections?
So I'm going to say just hopefully, yes. Like ideally, this would be the kind of work that can sort of set us up on a really good foundation to know where we can plug in as some of that funding and some of those projects and some of those. I think that a lot of these findings line up pretty nicely with some of the priorities that have been articulated in some of that legislation and some of that of those funding priorities. So hopefully there will be, like we said, like very nice synergies for that. But Jessica, do you have other thoughts? Would you like to chime in?
Thank you. Yeah, I just I'm seeing a lot of correlation between some of the work that I'm doing with IRA in the energy space, and just because I'm so plugged into that, no pun intended, and the way that funding is rolling out from those other federal agencies, I've just been kind of waiting for USDA and Department of the Interior programs to roll out and how they're going to take a more systemic approach to how to get everything to work together climate change wise for climate change and the opportunities for community engagement and social science, and just that whole systemic approach is really I see like you guys are on the right track, and I can't wait to see how this connects, honestly. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for those insightful comments and those very kind words. It's very much appreciated. Yeah, and we'll see as stuff starts to trickle down, like you said, as it sort of makes its way through the layers. Because we haven't, like I said, we haven't gotten anything like any specific directives yet at our level, but we have basically been told to prep and be ready. So yeah.
Heather, there's a question in the chat that perhaps you're best able to speak to, since you were really involved in creating and designing the project. Charlotte Lee asked, were the goals and outputs of the Grassland synthesis identified before you started, or did the goals and outcomes develop over the course of the project?
Ooh, that's a great question. And I would say it was a little bit of both. So we knew that we would probably be, because, you know, we're academics and we sit in an academic institution, that we would be, you know, creating peer-reviewed stuff that would come out of this. And Christy didn't mention, but we have a couple of those in the pipeline as well, talking about, you know, different aspects of this process and the findings and things. So we knew we would just kind of have to do that. We knew that we wanted to start with the management priorities working group, because we really wanted to identify, again, kind of the context in which these managers are making these decisions, and the kinds of information that might be that either they had articulated would be very helpful for them in these existing reports and things, or that we could sort of pull together based on the challenges that they were articulating, the goals that they were articulating in those management documents, what type of information would be most helpful. So we designed that purposefully to be kind of the base. And since we knew that not everyone is going to read a peer-reviewed publication, not everyone is going to read, I mean, even researchers aren't going to read these massive, Christy, how many pages is it combined?
Yeah,
almost 700.
Combined, 638 combined for the two reports.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, I mean, if you round down, it's only 600. But even that, like, we're not going to read all of that in the academic community. So we knew that, and we had decided that we were going to be very open to producing different kinds of things. So 2-pagers were kind of one of that summarized the key stuff. Those 2-pagers that Christy highlighted, we knew that those would probably be a likely output, but we are still kind of iterating and thinking about other ways to get that information into the hands of the folks who might be the most likely to use it. So we're researchers, so reaching other researchers that sounded really weird. Reaching other researchers, you know, is kind of the low-hanging fruit for us. We know how to kind of communicate with our wider community. But yeah, thinking about, you know, producing maybe like short videos, like 2 to 3 minute videos that maybe summarize some of the climate information that's in the climate and ecologies report, you know, other forms of outreach. And again, we're kind of open to what that looks like. It has changed over the course of the project. And I imagine in, you know, the next couple of months, as we start getting these findings out there more and more and try to reach more people, we'll probably have other ideas about how the, you know, best ways to communicate those are. So please, if anyone on this, if anyone on this call, if anyone on this webinar has ideas about particularly effective communication devices or methods, you know, places that we can put notices of like, hey, we have some of this information. We'd love to talk to your groups about them if they're interested. Please let us know. We would love to hear from you all.